My father never wasted words. In 31 years, I could count on one hand the times he told me he loved me out loud. He showed it in other ways, the way he left the porch light on when I came home late in college. The way he kept every drawing I ever made as a kid in a folder in his desk. The way he squeezed my shoulder at my mother's funeral when I was 16 and couldn't stop shaking. So, when his attorney called me, 6 weeks after we buried him, and said my father had left specific instructions about a phone, his personal iPhone, sealed in an envelope, with a note that said only I was allowed to open it, I didn't question it. My father did nothing without a reason. Sarah was sitting across from me at the kitchen table when the call came in. She had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, half listening to the news on the TV above the counter. We'd been together 4 years, living together for 2. She was the kind of woman who cried at commercials and remembered every birthday and always knew when I needed space before I even asked for it. At least, that's who I thought she was. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. He had handled my father's affairs for over a decade. His voice was careful, measured, the way attorneys always sound when they're delivering something unusual. Your father was very specific, he said. The phone is locked. He said you would know the code. And then he paused. He said not to tell Sarah about it. Not until you've seen everything. I felt something cold move through me. I kept my face still. Sarah was watching me over the rim of her mug. Just some paperwork from Dad's estate, I said. I'll handle it tomorrow. She nodded and looked back at the TV. That night I drove to Mr. Calloway's office alone, told Sarah I needed to pick up some documents and clear my head. The envelope was small, padded, my name written in my father's handwriting across the front. In the car, I sat with it in my lap for a full minute before I opened it. The phone inside was an older model, the screen dark, battery dead. I drove home, plugged it in, and waited until I heard Sarah's breathing go slow, and even in the bedroom. I charged it in my office with the door closed. The code. He said I would know it. I tried our old address first. The house I grew up in on Birchwood Lane, 1482. Nothing. Then my mother's birthday. Nothing. Then the year we went on our only family vacation, the summer I turned 9, the trip to Yellowstone that my father talked about for the rest of his life. Arlene R. The phone unlocked. There was one video file. No title, no thumbnail. Just a timestamp from 3 months before he died. I pressed play. My father's face appeared. He was sitting at his kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten 1,000 breakfasts at. He looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed when he was alive, the kind of tired that goes bone deep, but his eyes were sharp. He had always had sharp eyes. He said, "If you're watching this, I'm already gone. And I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this to your face. I needed to be sure first. I needed to have everything documented before I came to you, because I knew if I told you too early, you'd confront them, and that would ruin everything I've been building. So I'm asking you one last time to be patient. Listen first. Then decide." I set the phone down on the desk and pressed my palms flat against the wood. My father never asked for patience from anyone. He was the most patient man I knew. The fact that he felt he needed to ask me told me everything about how serious this was before he said another word. He said, "It's about your uncle. And it's about Sarah." I want to tell you what happened in the weeks that followed with some sense of order, but the truth is my mind didn't process it in any orderly way. It came in waves. My father's voice on that video, steady and methodical, laid out what he had discovered over 8 months of quiet investigation. My uncle, his younger brother, the man who had been the best man at my parents' wedding, who had helped me move into my first apartment, who called himself my second father after my mother died, had been systematically draining my father's investment portfolio. He had forged authorization signatures on transfer documents. He had set up 2 shell accounts, one in a business name that sounded legitimate, one under a variation of my father's own name. Over the course of 2 years, he had moved $380,000 out of accounts. My father didn't check regularly, accounts that had been set up decades ago and left to grow. And Sarah. My father said her name gently. He knew what it would do to me. He said he didn't believe she had been the one to initiate it. He believed my uncle had approached her. Had found her at a moment when she was feeling financially insecure. Her freelance work had dried up the year before. I remembered that she'd been stressed about money and had made her an arrangement. She fed my uncle information, which accounts my father accessed, when he was traveling, whether he was talking to his attorney. In return, my uncle had paid off the remainder of her graduate school loans, $22,000, deposited quietly into her bank account in 2 installments. My father said, "I don't know if she loves you. I believe she might. But she made a choice and I need you to know about it." The screen went dark. I sat in my office until 4 in the morning. Then I went to bed and lay beside Sarah and stared at the ceiling and listened to her sleep. I thought about my father at his kitchen table, filming that video. Knowing he was dying, his heart had been weakening for 2 years, the doctors had told us both, and choosing to spend his remaining energy not on rest, not on goodbyes, but on making sure I wouldn't be left exposed. He had been a quiet man who showed love in practical ways. This was the most practical thing he had ever done for me. I heard his voice in my head. He had said, "Don't move yet. There's more on the phone. Look at the files." The next night I went back to the phone. He had organized everything. Screenshots of the transfer confirmations. PDFs of the forged documents with his real signature scanned beside the forgeries for comparison. A recorded phone call between my uncle and Sarah that my father had somehow managed to capture. I still don't know exactly how, and maybe I don't need to. In the recording, my uncle said to Sarah, "He's going to the attorney again next Thursday. Find out what for." Sarah's voice, unmistakable, said she'd handle it. She sounded tired. She did not sound like someone who was enjoying herself. My father had also included a name and a number. A financial forensics investigator named Patricia Webb, who he had hired 4 months before he died. He had already paid her retainer. He had already briefed her on everything. He had left her instructions to wait for my call. I called her the next morning from my car, parked 3 blocks from the house. She answered on the second ring and said, "I've been waiting to hear from you. Your father told me you'd need a little time. He said you were someone who needed to feel the full weight of something before you acted on it. He said that was your best quality and your most frustrating one." It sounded so much like him that I had to press my fist against my mouth for a moment before I could speak. Patricia walked me through what she had compiled on top of my father's own documentation. She had traced the shell accounts. She had identified the point at which the forged signatures diverged from my father's authentic ones, subtle differences but consistent, the kind that a forensic examiner could demonstrate clearly in court. She had also found something my father hadn't known about. My uncle had taken out a loan using my father's business assets as collateral. The loan was for $60,000. It had been processed 4 months before my father died, at a time when my father's health had been declining and his attention to paperwork had naturally slipped. So the total was closer to $440,000. I thanked her and told her to keep building the file. I told her I needed 2 more weeks. Those 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went home every evening to Sarah. I cooked dinner with her. I watched television on the couch with her feet in my lap. I helped her brainstorm ideas for a new client pitch. She laughed at something I said on a Tuesday night and reached over and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, and the whole time I was thinking about her voice on that recording. She sounded tired. She had not sounded happy. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that she made a choice. She could have come to me. She could have told my uncle no. She could have told me afterward, could have found any number of moments in 4 years to tell me the truth. She didn't. And every morning I woke up next to her, I thought about my father at his kitchen table, spending what was left of his life building me a ladder out of the hole they had dug. I installed a monitoring app on our shared home laptop, the one we both used to manage household finances, bills, subscriptions. Within 48 hours I had enough. Sarah had been in regular contact with my uncle by email. Nothing incriminating anymore. My father's death had seemingly spooked them both into surface-level communication. But the pattern was there, the relationship was there. And one email from 6 weeks ago, sent 2 days after my father's funeral, said only, "He doesn't suspect anything. We should be fine." I read it 3 times. I took a screenshot. I forwarded everything to Patricia. Then I called Mr. Calloway. I told him I was ready. I told him I wanted to move on everything at once, not in pieces. He said, "Your father told me you'd say exactly that." I asked him what else my father had told him. He said, "He told me you were the most principled person he'd ever raised, and that you'd probably be furious at him for going about this the way he did instead of just talking to you. He said to tell you he was sorry about that. He said he ran out of time." I couldn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Tell me what to do." Mr. Calloway had already drafted the civil complaints. Patricia's documentation was ready to be filed as supporting evidence. There was also a criminal referral component, wire fraud, forgery, financial elder abuse, that had been prepared in coordination with an attorney who specialized in exactly that. My uncle didn't know that my father had been working with any of these people. As far as my uncle knew, my father had died without ever discovering what had been taken from him. That was the thing about my uncle. He had always underestimated my father. Everyone did. My father was quiet. He was methodical. He was the kind of man who spent 30 years building something solid and never once needed anyone to notice. My uncle saw that quietness as passivity. He mistook patience for ignorance. He was wrong about that his whole life. On a Thursday morning, While Sarah was in the shower and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, I opened my laptop and sent 3 emails. One to Mr. Calloway, file everything today. One to Patricia, release the full documentation package. One to the financial institution that held my father's remaining accounts. I had already spoken with their fraud division, and this email was the agreed-upon trigger to freeze all accounts tied to the shell entities my uncle had created. Then I closed the laptop and poured my coffee down the drain and waited. By noon, my uncle's attorney was calling Mr. Calloway's office. By 2 o'clock, the loan my uncle had taken against my father's business assets had been flagged and suspended pending fraud investigation. By 4 o'clock, the civil complaints had been filed and were a matter of public record. Sarah came home from a coffee meeting at 6. I was sitting on the couch. The lights were on. I had not turned on the television. She could feel it the second she walked in. I watched her read the room. Her coat was half off and she stopped moving. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Come sit down." She sat in the chair across from me instead of next to me on the couch. I noticed that. I turned the laptop toward her and let her see the screen. I had pulled up the civil complaint filing. Her name was in it. It was a matter of public record now. I watched her face go through 5 different things in the space of about 4 seconds. Then it went still. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." She said, "I need you to know that I never wanted." I said, "I need you to not finish that sentence right now." She stopped. There was a long silence. I said, "My father knew. Before he died. He spent the last months of his life documenting everything because he wanted to make sure I was protected after he was gone. He recorded everything. He hired people. He built a case from his kitchen table while his heart was failing, because he couldn't trust the people in my life to do the right thing." Sarah had her hand pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were wet. I said, "I'm not interested in your reasons tonight. I've heard the recording. I know how it started. I know what he offered you and I know what you gave him in return. I need you to get your things and go stay somewhere else while this is resolved. My attorney will be in touch." She said, "James?" I said, "My name is not James. That's not my story." She said, "My name? My actual name?" She said it the way she used to say it, in good moments, in easy moments, and for a second it landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. I stood up. I said, "I loved you. And my father protected me from what you were doing even while he was dying. That's something I'm going to have to live with for a long time, and so are you." She left that night. She texted me twice from wherever she went, her sisters, I assumed. I didn't respond. I forwarded the text to my attorney and told him to keep them on file. My uncle called me at 9:30 that same night. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 10. Then at 10:15, I sat in my father's old armchair. I had moved it to my house after the funeral, the brown leather one he'd had since before I was born, and I listened to it ring and I did not answer. The voicemails were what you'd expect. Denial. Then a version of explanation that was mostly more denial wrapped in different words. Then, on the 3rd message, something that was almost an admission. He said things had gotten complicated. He said he'd meant to fix it. He said my father had never understood the pressure he'd been under. I listened to all 3 messages once. Then I sent them to my attorney. What followed in the weeks after was slow and procedural and not very dramatic in the way that legal processes almost never are from the inside. My uncle retained a defense attorney. The criminal referral was picked up by the county prosecutor's office. Financial elder abuse carries serious weight in this state, and the documentation was thorough enough that the intake was fast. The civil complaint moved forward on a separate track. Patricia's forensic report was submitted as expert evidence. The forged signatures, the shell account documentation, the transfer history, all of it laid out in a form that left very little room for alternative interpretation. My uncle's attorney entered a not guilty plea. That didn't surprise me. My attorney told me to be prepared for it to take a year or more to fully resolve. I told him I had learned patience from my father, and he gave me a look that I think was meant to be sympathetic. Sarah cooperated with the investigation. She was not the primary target the money had flowed to and through my uncle, not to her, but she gave a full statement, confirmed the recorded conversation, confirmed the loan payoff. In return, the prosecutor agreed not to pursue charges against her directly. My civil attorney told me I could pursue a separate action against her if I chose to. I thought about it for a long time. I decided not to. Not because what she did didn't matter. It did. It still does. But because I didn't want to spend another year of my life inside that story, I wanted to be done with the chapter that included her in it. 2 months after the filings, I drove out to the cemetery on a Sunday morning. It was cold, early November, the kind of gray that sits low and doesn't lift. I brought 2 coffees out of habit and then felt slightly ridiculous standing there holding both of them. I set one on the ground next to the headstone. I told my father what had happened. I told him about Mr. Calloway, about Patricia, about the look on Sarah's face when I turned the laptop toward her. I told him the criminal case was moving forward and that his documentation had made the difference. Then I told him I was angry at him. Not for what he did for going about it alone, for spending his last months in the weight of this instead of letting me carry some of it. I told him he should have told me. I told him I was 31 years old and I could have handled it. I told him the porch light thing didn't work when the house was gone. Then I stood there for a while with my hands in my pockets and my breath making small clouds in the cold air. My father had kept a voicemail from my mother on his phone for 11 years after she died. I know because I found it when I was going through his things, 43 seconds long. She was calling to ask if he wanted her to pick up anything from the grocery store. Nothing significant. She just wanted to know if he needed milk. He had kept it for 11 years because it was her voice, unrehearsed, in an ordinary moment. Proof that she had been there. I went back to the car, and I sat with my father's old phone in my hands. I went back through the files. I had looked at them all before the transfer documents, the screenshots, the recordings, but I hadn't looked at everything. There was a folder I had opened once and not fully explored, labeled simply with my name. Inside it were photographs. Me at 8, gap-toothed, holding a fish at a lake I barely remember now. Me at my high school graduation, squinting in the sun. Me and my mother together, a photo I hadn't seen in years. Me at my college graduation, my father standing next to me with his hand on my shoulder, both of us looking at the camera with the exact same expression. And at the bottom of the folder, a voice memo. Recorded 2 weeks before he died. I pressed play. He said, "I've been trying to figure out how to end this. What to say at the end of all this that means something. I've never been good at that kind of thing. Your mother was better at it. She always knew what to say." He paused for a long time. Long enough that I thought the recording had ended. Then he said, "I'm proud of you." I should have said that more. I was proud of you when you were 8 and you caught that fish and threw it back because you didn't want it to be scared. I was proud of you at your mother's funeral when you held yourself together even though I could see what it cost you. I'm proud of you right now, watching you become the kind of man who will handle what I'm leaving you with the right way. I don't have any doubt about that. You were always going to be okay. I just needed to make sure I gave you the tools. He was quiet again. He said, "I know you're mad at me for doing this alone. You're allowed to be. But I want you to know this was the last real thing I could do for you. And I needed to do it. That's just who I am." Then at the very end, quiet and unhurried, the way he said everything important, "I love you, son." The recording ended. 48 seconds. I sat in the parking lot of the cemetery until the coffee went cold. Then I drove home, and I sat in my father's old leather chair, and I let myself feel everything I had been keeping on a shelf for 2 months. I let it all come down. My uncle pleaded guilty 8 months later to 2 of the 5 counts as part of a negotiated plea. He was ordered to pay full restitution plus interest, was sentenced to 18 months of supervised release, and was permanently barred from acting as a fiduciary in any capacity. He has not spoken to me since the plea. I haven't tried to contact him either. Maybe someday. Not yet. The $440,000 minus legal fees, minus Patricia's final invoice went into a foundation I set up in my father's name. It funds financial literacy programs for families who are managing estates, trying to help people understand what they're signing, what they're inheriting, who has access to what and when. The kind of information that could have protected my father years earlier if anyone had thought to put it in front of him. I named it after him. Not a foundation for grief, not a memorial to loss, a practical thing. Because he was a practical man. Something that works. Something that keeps working after you're gone. I still have the phone. I've charged it every few weeks since that Sunday in November. I don't go through the files anymore. I go to the voice memo at the bottom of the folder and I play those 48 seconds, and I sit with my father's voice in the room for a little while. 43 seconds of my mother asking about milk. 48 seconds of my father saying what he should have said every day. Some people say the things they feel. Some people build them, document them, organize them into folders, and leave them for the people they love to find when the time is right. My father was the second kind. I don't think either way is better than the other. I think you love the people in front of you in the language you were given, and you hope it reaches them in the language they need. Has reached me.